A few months ago, I started going for late-night jogs in a nearby park. It wasn't something I'd normally do, but I'd been struggling with stress and insomnia, and the park was peaceful at night. It wasn't large, just a few trails, a playground, and a pond. The first couple of nights were uneventful. The park was completely empty, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hum of traffic. But on the third night, I started noticing odd things. As I jogged past the playground, I thought I saw someone sitting on one of the swings. I slowed down, squinting to get a better look. But the swing was empty. I chalked it up to my imagination and kept going. On the next lap, I heard faint laughter, high-pitched and short, like a child's giggle. It came from the direction of the pond, but when I stopped to listen, the sound disappeared. By the time I finished my jog, I felt on edge. The park, which had felt peaceful before, now seemed wrong. The air felt heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next night, I hesitated to go back, but convinced myself it was all in my head. I started jogging again, trying to ignore the uneasiness. When I passed the playground this time, I was sure I saw movement, a figure darting behind the slide. I froze, staring at the playground, but nothing happened. I decided to cut my jog short and head back. As I walked toward the park entrance, I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow and deliberate, matching mine perfectly. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but the path was empty. My heart was racing now, and I quickened my pace. The footsteps sped up too, stopping only when I reached the parking lot. The next day, I told myself I wouldn't go back, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to return, this time without headphones, so I could stay more aware of my surroundings. As soon as I entered the park, I felt it again, that oppressive heaviness, like the air itself was watching me. I kept my pace slow, scanning the trees and shadows around me. When I passed the playground, I heard it again, the giggle. It was closer this time, and it sent chills down my spine. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but got no response. I decided to check the pond, thinking maybe someone was messing with me. As I approached the water, I saw ripples moving across the surface, even though the air was still. Then, just as I reached the edge, I saw it. A pale figure standing knee-deep in the water, facing away from me. I froze, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I slowly backed away, trying to put as much distance between me and it as possible. As I turned to leave, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. "Don't leave me." I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, gasping for breath. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what I'd just seen, but something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A figure was standing at the edge of the parking lot, just barely visible in the glow of the streetlights. The next day, I told a friend about what happened. She mentioned an old urban legend about the park, a child who drowned in the pond years ago, whose spirit supposedly lingered, waiting for someone to keep them company. I haven't been back to the park since. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear faint laughter outside my window, but I tell myself it's just the wind. Whatever I encountered in that park, I don't think it wanted me to leave, and I have no intention of finding out why. A few weeks ago, I started taking nightly walks in the park near my apartment. It wasn't a big park, just a few winding paths, a couple of benches, and a large central fountain. I usually went late, around 11 p.m., because I liked the quiet. For the first few nights, everything was normal. The park was dimly lit by a few scattered lamps, and I'd sometimes pass by the occasional dog walker or jogger. But after about a week, I began to notice something strange. One night, as I walked past the fountain, I saw a figure sitting on a bench near the edge of the light. I didn't think much of it, until I realized the figure wasn't moving. It just sat there, perfectly still, facing the fountain. I kept walking, trying not to look directly at them. As I passed, I glanced over my shoulder and they were gone. I froze, my eyes scanning the area, but there was no one there. The next night I went back, telling myself I must have imagined it. Everything seemed normal at first, but as I passed the fountain again, I felt something, like I was being watched. I turned and saw the same bench. This time the figure was back, sitting in the exact same position. I stopped and stared, but the longer I looked, the more uncomfortable I felt. It was as if the figure was aware of me, even though it didn't move. I decided to cut my walk short and headed back home. That night I had trouble sleeping. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that park. The following night I almost didn't go back, but curiosity got the better of me. I told myself I'd stick to the well-lit parts of the park and avoid the fountain. Everything seemed fine at first. I took a different route, staying near the path closest to the street. But as I rounded a corner, I saw the figure again. This time, they were standing in the distance, just beyond the edge of the path's light. I stopped, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. I took a step closer, trying to make out any details, but the moment I did, the park lights flickered. When they came back on, the figure was gone. My heart was racing, but I convinced myself to keep going. As I walked, I started to hear faint footsteps behind me. They were slow and deliberate, matching mine exactly. I stopped and turned around, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped too, but as soon as I began walking again, they started up again, closer this time. I quickened my pace, trying to get to the exit. The footsteps grew louder, more erratic, as if whoever, or whatever, was following me was running now. Finally, I reached the park gate and practically sprinted home. Once I was inside, I locked the door and turned off all the lights. That night, as I sat in my dark apartment, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, a soft tapping on my window. I didn't dare look, but the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. When I finally worked up the courage to glance outside, the street was empty. But the next morning, when I opened my door, I found a single wet footprint on my doorstep. I haven't been back to the park since, and I don't plan to. Whatever was in that park didn't want me there, and I'm afraid it might have followed me home. About a month ago, I started jogging at night. My schedule got so packed during the day that evenings were my only free time, and the park near my apartment was perfect. Quiet, well lit in most areas, and usually empty after dark. There was a particular route I liked to take, one that looped through a path lined with old oak trees. It felt peaceful, even at night. But last week, something happened that I still can't explain. I was about halfway through my usual route when I noticed someone sitting on a bench under one of the larger oak trees. It wasn't unusual to see people there, but this person was just sitting, motionless, in the shadows cast by the tree's branches. I kept jogging, avoiding eye contact, but as I passed, I had the distinct feeling they were staring at me. When I reached the other side of the park, I turned back to complete my loop. As I approached this same bench, the person was gone. I figured they must have left, but then I saw something strange, the outline of a handprint on the bench, faintly visible under the dim light of a nearby lamp. I ignored it, brushing it off as nothing, and continued home. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something about the way the figure just sat there, perfectly still, unsettled me. The next night, I told myself I was being paranoid. I went back to the park, determined to enjoy my run. Everything felt normal, until I reached the oak tree again. The bench was empty this time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I slowed down and looked around, half expecting to see the figure from the night before. That's when I noticed it, a faint sound like someone whispering, coming from behind the tree. I stopped, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, low and guttural, repeating something I couldn't understand. My gut told me to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer to the tree, peering around its massive trunk. The space behind it was empty, but the whispering didn't stop. It sounded as if it was circling me, moving in the air but coming from nowhere. Panic set in, and I turned to leave. As I jogged back toward the entrance, I glanced over my shoulder and froze. The bench was no longer empty. The figure was back, sitting in the same position as before, but this time their head was tilted slightly toward me. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I sprinted out of the park and straight home, locking my door behind me. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard faint tapping on my bedroom window. I live on the 3rd floor. The next morning, I found a small piece of bark from an oak tree on my windowsill. I haven't gone back to the park since. Whatever was in that park wasn't just watching. It was waiting. For what? I don't want to know.